Hello everybody and welcome to the first part of a series of videos I'm going to do on art styles. This one will cover lines, but before I get into that I want to lay out the kind of idea on what style is, talk about the series, stuff like that. So what is a style? A style is essentially how you draw things, and a very boiled down way of saying it. In a more wordy version, it is the way you draw the representation or understanding of something you have thought about or seen. So in this breakdown, I'm going to take the big topic of ways to make images that represent stuff into different parts. So this one's going to be line. Later on, I'm going to make one on shape, exaggeration, color, detailing, shading, and to kind of wrap it all up, I'm gonna try to make one called design language, and that's kind of how you put sections together. So now to get into the actual topic for the video is line, which is essentially a bordering or a way to draft an object that you're going to represent. The first decision that I would say to do when starting to construct your line work is to actually pick a brush tip. This will alter a little bit of how to perceive your art piece. And usually I give it between textured tools or pencil tools, pen tools, or brush, a brush tool, with airbrush being kind of somewhere in between all these things, where it's just you can make it softer or harder on its edges, which will change a lot on how you do it, while the other ones usually have a set range they go on that I'll talk about a little bit. So for the first tool or brush tip I want to talk about for lines is going to be the pencil tool. So a pencil tool, or a tool that has a texture quality for a type of paper or canvas, will give you a sense of feeling that it was on something, but at the same time, because of those dips in the amount of paint or opacity, will give you the feeling that it's not what I picked up in college is called ephemeral, but it's like that it won't last. It has sometimes a more dreamlike quality, but I feel that's a little bit more prevalent in paint. Also, with the jaggedness of usually around the tool, with all the indents, it also has a sense of energy that you won't get in the other tools as much. Also, with it being more of a less solid form, it often gives a sense of a transitionary piece into some other thing. That may not always be the case, but that's a lot of the time where you'll think about a picture when you see pencil marks. So next on our list of line tools is going to be the pen tool or line tool. And this gives you a very hard edge to your art, generally speaking, and it will make your pieces look clean. The point is to make your art look clean with it usually. So with the pen tool having such a hard line edge, this usually gives a more solid separation of forms, where in the natural world it's actually variation in color that will let you tell that two things that are right next to each other aren't one giant object. But these types of lines are also very good for, obviously, separation, but also just boldening parts of your drawing. Then lastly, on the line tools section of this video, I'll talk a bit more about using a paintbrush or paintbrush tool to make your lines. Paint lines more have a fading quality. Usually at the edges of their stroke will have a little bit of a bleed that kind of fade into the other parts of your art piece. And this is probably more aligned with more of a natural feeling line work when you're doing it, unlike the hard lines of the pen tool. with it looking like it's faded, it will also sometimes give you a kind of rounded three-dimensional quality to it from just the lines itself, which can be nice, but it can also not be what you want in your line work. Then there is no lines at all, which usually needs you to have the other parts that I will talk about in the later videos. These need to be really strong to have like shading to be able to separate your forms, strong color differences, these kinds of things to really like separate it. And it's going to have to be like those forms need to be really strong. Alright, so now on to our next section for lines is going to be the weight or thickness of your lines and how that will like change your style when you apply it. So generally speaking, when you use a thicker line, it will separate your objects a bit more, or your parts, and that'll leave more of a less of a realistic style and more of a kind of stylized or like more image quality to it. And when you have these thicker lines, it makes the bending of any of the forms you have a little bit harder and more difficult. This also applies for exaggeration, which we'll talk about in another episode. But basically that makes it a little bit harder to do, though it will grab attention better than if you're using a smaller line. Things will also generally feel static when you use a thicker line as opposed to a thinner line. And with a thin line, it can give more and with a thin line, it's harder to really register the line work, but instead it is easier for someone's eyes to focus on the shape or form that they're giving with the line, and it's easier to bend it into the form you're wanting. Usually using these smaller lines or a bunch of smaller lines will give your art a bit more energy than, say, a swoop or whatnot of a thicker line, especially a much thicker line. Now you can mix up your line weights as well and give some parts different meanings, where usually you want to use thicker lines either as a kind of shadow portion of your line, like wherever a shadow would be forming, or where a bend would happen. You can either choose to have it where kind of light is taking away that shadow on your bend or not. You can use it under, like obviously under, kind of as I was saying before, for a shadow. You can also use them as outlines and border around whatever object you want, a specific object, or around an entire piece as well. Usually that gives a sticker-like effect, which is interesting because it's just that object. But if you keep all your lines uniform, usually you want to have a certain level of control with how much people will focus on your line work and how much, and having strong shapes to overpower the feeling that everything has the same weight to it. Also, where you will break up your lines is another important thing, which is similar to like the thinning, but the points when you want to have breaks in your line are either to show usually movement, or if you want the shapes that are adjacent to each other that you're having that break in to bleed through. Like there's no real hard separation for those. And you can use this, you can or use thinner lines for wherever those parts are closer to not having a direct separation. Those kinds of things depend on you and how you want to change your style about how you want shapes to mesh together. So the last part for this video is going to cover line confidence, which is basically making your lines clean, not having the little jitteriness or waviness to parts of it. Usually comes from practicing making those really like clean, quick strokes for each part of your line work. Also, obviously, stabilization programs really help with that a lot of the time, but also practice will definitely help. And then also, it is controlling how hard you're pressing down, controlling your weights, knowing where to put them, and so you're not like really hard mashing your pen down all the time, which is a problem I have a lot, but also being able to let up and soften your stroke where you need it. And obviously this doesn't have too much to do with if you're having it all be kind of uniform, or keeping your brush value range down will also help you keep it at a certain level. So there's this thing a lot of art teachers back in university and even probably in high school, though I can't remember, where they would early on they would actually ask us to mess around and test the pens and brushes that we would have, and this often wasn't really compelling to me to go and do and to like practice that. But thinking about less how it makes the strokes and the types of lines, and instead thinking about what feelings that it is best to emote with them, is more in line with, I think, finding a style than a lot of people will realize or teach. And so, especially for this, like when thinking specifically on what types of things that you want to draw, like based off of like expression, and trying to find your voice in that is the more important than just knowing that you can make brush strokes out of it and where things taper, stuff like that. Though it is important, I think, for people really worried about finding a style, I think need to take this other approach to it to really get that.